Halo, selamat malam teman-teman. Welcome everyone. Kepada teman-teman yang sedang menyimak dari Indonesia, selamat malam. Namo Buddhaya. Karena kami mengundang tamu dari Amerika, izinkan kami dari ITBC untuk berbicara menggunakan bahasa Inggris. Ladies and gentlemen, Namo Buddhaya. This is a special event where we have people from all over the world joining us. Whatever time zone you're in, I greet you a lovely day and wish everyone is happy and healthy. On this special day, we're delighted to welcome you to our online Dhamma talk. The Indonesian Taiwan Buddhist Community, ITBC, proudly presents today's Dhamma talk, where we have invited the most Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi Mahāthera. Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi will be covering topics about understanding the pattern of the Buddha's teachings, a guide to the sutta, to study the suttas. Interesting, isn't it? Stay tuned because the talk will start soon. Before we start, please make sure your microphone is muted. During the Q&A session, you will be given a chance to turn on your microphone while you're asking questions to Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. But remember, if you want to ask a question, please type your question in the chat room first and wait until the moderator allows you to speak. Please keep your question short and brief. The rule for asking questions is available on the chat room. Before we start, I have a question for all of you. Have you ever heard of ITBC before? Please raise your hand if you have ever known about ITBC. Thank you. So, before we start the talk, I'd like to invite Mr. Delvin Darmiko as the head of ITBC to give a brief introduction regarding ITBC. Delvin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Francisca. Ladies and gentlemen, Namo Buddhaya. First, I would like to say welcome to our audience today that came from around the world. It is such a unique opportunity for us to host a multinational Dhamma talk, and we're excited that the day for this event has finally come. But most importantly, we are gathered here to learn from one of the most prestigious Buddhist figures in the world, the most Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi, Mahāthera. We, from Indonesia Taiwan Buddhist Community, would like to give you our warmest welcome. The variety of participants' nationalities that attend this Dhamma talk shows how much influence Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi has. It is a great honor for ITBC to have invited you as our speaker for today's Dhamma talk. This event came to realization from the hard work of our committee, and we couldn't done this event without them. I would also like to give special thanks to Christopher Tito as our head of this event, as he is the one that keep in touch with Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi and making this event a reality. From the title of this Dhamma talk, Understanding the Pattern of Buddhist Teaching, a Guide to Study the Suttas. I hope that from this Dhamma talk we got to be better at studying suttas so we could learn and understand more about Buddhist teachings. Before I end my speech, let me introduce briefly about our community. Our community established in July last year based in Taipei. We are the first Indonesian Buddhist community in Taiwan. Our goal is to be a platform for Indonesian Buddhists in Taiwan. Our member consists of young professionals and college students, mainly in Taipei. Our weekly activities consist of Parita chanting and Dhamma talk. That's it about our brief introduction. I hope that today's event will bring new knowledge to us provided by Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi Mahāthera about Buddhism. To all the participants, thank you for attending this event, and I wish everyone a smooth event journey. Thank you. Namo Buddhaya.
Thank you, Delphine, for the great introduction of ITBC. Next, I would like to introduce Mr. Christopher Tito as our moderator today. He was born on March 28, 1996, in Jakarta, Indonesia. He got his bachelor degree in pharmacy from the University of Sanatha Dharma in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. And he is currently pursuing a master's degree in Taipei Medical University in Taiwan. Mr. Christopher, please.
Thank you, Francisca, for that very wonderful introduction. And thank you to everyone who has joined on this day. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good day to everyone here. Namo Buddhaya. We are delighted to have you all on this day, gathered from different places from all around the world. According to the registration data, we truly have a global audience gathered today. We have people from faraway places, such as the UK. We have people from Russia. We have people from the United Arab Emirates, from India, and from Australia, and from various other countries in the world. So I would like to give you all a warm welcome and thank you for coming. And of course, we have people from different parts of Indonesia as well. We are gathered here today to listen to a Dhamma talk, which will be given by the Most Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi Mahāthera, live from New York in the United States of America. I am sure that many of you are already familiar with who the Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi is. However, he is a world-renowned scholar and teacher of the Pali Buddhist texts. But for those who are still not familiar with Bhante, please allow me to give a short introduction. So as you can see, the Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi is an American Buddhist monk, originally from New York City. He holds a PhD in philosophy from Claremont Graduate University in 1972. After completing his university studies, he traveled to Sri Lanka, where he received a novice ordination in 1972 and full ordination in 1973. From 1984 until 2002, he was the editor for the Buddhist Publication Society in Kandy and its president from 1988 until 2010. The Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi has had many important publications to his credit, either as an author, as a translator, or as the editor. The Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi's most recent publication is called Reading the Buddhist Discourses in Pali, a practical guide to the language of the ancient Buddhist canon. Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi lives and teaches at Chuang Yen Monastery in upstate New York. In 2008, together with several of his students, he founded the Buddhist Global Relief, a nonprofit supporting hunger and poverty relief for poor people and poor communities all around the world. Now, as you can see, the Most Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi is truly a distinguished scholar. We are very grateful that Bhante has accepted our invitation today. His talk today will be titled Understanding the Pattern of the Buddhist Teaching, a guide to study the suttas. And before we begin to talk, I would like to remind everyone to please mute their microphones so that we do not disturb Bhante during this talk. Besides that, Bhante will give a brief talk for 45 minutes, and after the talk, we will have a 30-minute Q&A session. If you would like to ask a question, please type it first in the chat section, and I will then direct you to ask the question directly to Bhante. And now, with the formalities out of the way, I would like to give the floor to the Most Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi Mahāthera. I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen. It seems that Bhante has not connected yet. So before that, maybe I will give the floor back to the MC first. Francisca, please.
Okay, thank you, Christopher. Okay, so Christopher, I would like to ask you some questions. So do you often read the Tipitaka?
As for reading the Tipitaka, let me see. I want to confess that even though that I am a Buddhist, I don't really read the Tipitaka that often. it's quite a bit shameful for me because, as Buddhists, we should read the Tipitaka. But I find that it's a bit hard because it's such a huge book. In other religions and other belief systems, they have one book. The Tipitaka, as you may know, it's a really large collection of like really long books, and I don't know if if I can read it all. What about you? Do you read the Tipitaka?
Well, for me, I also read it sometimes, maybe when I go to the Vihara. Yes, I mean, of course, because I'm a Buddhist too, and I will also read it, but maybe I used to read it at school, because in our country, in Indonesia, we're supposed to take the religion course. So I read it that time, but after that, I think, yeah, I also seldom read it. As what you say just now, really, the Tripitaka indeed consists of a lot of collections. Well, what about, do you know what the teachings contain?
Actually, I do have an idea of what the teachings contain, but I'm not very familiar with it. So I'm hoping that today with Bhikkhu Bodhi's Dhamma talk, I hope that the Venerable Bhikkhu can give us a wonderful talk and explain to us for lay people, because I'm sure that most of us are lay here, right? I think there's only one more monk or nun. So I'm hoping that the Venerable Bhikkhu may help us to explain the contents of the Tipitaka. And it seems that now we have the Venerable Bhikkhu online. So maybe we can get the Venerable Bhikkhu on. Hello, good morning.
Yeah,
Venerable
I am
Bhikkhu.
on. Yeah, I'm on now. Yeah.
Good morning. How
Good
is
morning,
it in
yeah.
New York?
Excuse me?
How are you today, sir?
Oh, I'm all right, thank you.
And so, yeah, so I think we have everyone gathered here today. And Venerable Bhikkhu, would you like to start your talk today? Would you like to start your talk now? Is that okay?
Well, I announced the time on the announcement that I sent out to my students and to our registration list here at the Buddhist Association. I announced the time to start would be 8 o'clock.
8 o'clock, okay.
So it's quite possible that a number of people have not yet joined, that they will join at 8 o'clock.
I see. Okay, yeah. So maybe before we can start, Sis Francisca and I were just discussing a few things, because we are Buddhists, and the thing about Buddhists is that sometimes it's hard for us to, when we're compared to other religions, especially concerning the Tipitaka and the holy books, and other religions and other beliefs, they have like their own holy books, and they're quite, let's say, compact compared to what we have in Buddhism. So it was our hope that today the Venerable Bhikkhu would, give a Dhamma talk regarding how can we as Buddhists learn and appreciate the Tipitaka. And we're also informed that the Venerable Bhikkhu has also published a book last year called The Buddhist Discourses in Reading the Buddhist Discourses in Pali, a practical guide to the language of the ancient Buddhist canon. May I ask, is that book available online through Amazon by ebook?
I believe you can order it as an ebook from Amazon. So in my opinion, I suggest that if one is intended really as a book for studying the Pali language, based on passages from the Sutta Pitaka, it's not a Pali primer. It's not intended to introduce a reader to the language who's starting from scratch, but it's primarily intended for those who have already learned the basics of Pali grammar and now want to see how to use their knowledge of Pali grammar and some knowledge of Pali vocabulary to read the discourses. And so for that reason, my own recommendation is to get the paper copy of the book, the hard copy, rather than to use an electronic version.
I see.
Though some people, perhaps people from the younger generation, are more capable, more skilled in using electronic versions of books, but I still come from an older generation. And so for novels and simpler books, then I would say that, the electronic copy is just as, maybe even more convenient than the paper copy. But this is a kind of workbook in which you'll be flipping back and forth from the notes on the grammar to the original reading passage. And it's rather unwieldy to do that with an electronic copy.
I see, yeah. I also have that bias. I think it's easier and it's more practical, and it also feels, I don't know, better to hold a physical book in your hands,
Yeah, that is true.
Yeah. So since we are going to talk about, it's another book that you've written, right? It's an anthology of the Buddhist Suitors, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and we from ITBC have already sent it's a Word document which contains a table of contents of Bhante's book regarding the Suitors. And so for those of you who have already received the email and have already received the Word document, you may read it to get an idea of what the talk will be about. And Bhante, before we start the talk, perhaps you could share with us regarding the foundation that you have founded a few years ago, the Buddhist Global Relief.
Yeah, technically, in legal terms, it's not considered a foundation, but it's an organization.
Oh, a nonprofit, right?
Yeah, it's a nonprofit, which it was established for the purpose of providing help to poor communities around the world who are afflicted with the problem of chronic hunger and malnutrition.
Mm.
And so we started in 2008, maybe the first project's the end of 2008, supporting 3 projects, one in Sri Lanka, one in Vietnam, one in Myanmar. And over the years, we've grown quite extensively, much more rapidly than we expected. So now for the coming year, we're going to be supporting more than 50 projects in countries ranging from Vietnam, Cambodia, Mongolia, India, Afghanistan,
Wow.
through some African countries, Kenya, Malawi, Cote d'Ivoire, Cameroon, through Bangladesh as well, and then some countries in Latin America, Peru, Brazil, Haiti, and some projects in the United States.
Wow, that's
Yeah,
amazing.
and we don't just simply we don't simply provide direct food aid to people afflicted with hunger, but rather we found that it's also necessary to tackle the underlying roots of hunger and malnutrition, and that is primarily poverty. And we also found the most effective way to tackle the problem of poverty is by supporting the education of girls and providing right livelihood vocational training for women so that they can support their families. And so we range over a number of areas: direct food aid, education for poor girls, vocational training for poor women, and supporting ecologically sustainable types of agriculture.
Wow.
Yeah, you could go to find out more. You go to the website just look up Buddhist Global Relief.
Okay, so maybe after the talk, we can also give the link to the people here.
Yeah.
That they can access it. And if the people would like to donate, then you can do so. Okay. So, Bhante, I believe it is now 8 o'clock, so if you may, I will give the floor to you to begin the Dharma talk. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so first I want to thank the Indonesian Buddhists in Taiwan for inviting me to give this talk. The topic that you suggested is how to encourage ordinary lay Buddhists to read the Tipitaka. And the first thing I will say is that the Tipitaka in its published form consists of maybe more than 40 volumes, which is the bad news. The good news is that you don't really have to be concerned with the whole Tipitaka. The Tipitaka means literally the 3 collections, and the 3 collections is the Vinaya-Pitaka, which is the collection of the rules and regulations for the monastic order. And so unless you want to become a monastic, then it's not really necessary to read the Vinaya-Pitaka itself. And then the 3rd collection is the Abhidhamma-Pitaka, which is a collection of sort of systematic philosophical treatises of a rather technical nature. And those, after becoming familiar with the Dhamma, you might want to delve into the Abhidhamma. I don't suggest beginning by turning to the Abhidhamma-Pitaka, which can be very dry, technical, and highly systematic, so it might be discouraging. But the collection that you would want to be concerned with is the Sutta Pitaka. But now when you turn to the Sutta Pitaka and just try to read it, starting from the first book and continuing on, you come across a problem. And this is the problem that I found when I was a young monk, just newly ordained in Sri Lanka. My intention was to read the Sutta Pitaka, but I found myself bewildered in that the texts are not arranged in any kind of what I would call meaningful, systematic order. So the primary books of the Sutta Pitaka are the Digha Nikaya, Majjhima Nikaya, Samyutta Nikaya, Anguttara Nikaya. The Digha Nikaya means the long discourses, and it contains, as the name suggests, the longer suttas. The middle-length, the Majjhima Nikaya is the middle-length discourses, and it contains suttas, or discourses, of middle length. The Samyutta Nikaya is a bit more meaningful in the principle of organization, in that it collects together suttas that revolve around a common theme. So each chapter has a single theme, and then it collects a number of short suttas addressing that theme. Then the 4th collection is the Anguttara Nikaya, the numerical discourses, which is organized simply according to a numerical pattern of arrangement. All of this, for example, the chapters, the 11 chapters of the Book of Ones, Book of Twos, Book of Threes, and so on, up to the Book of 11s. And all that unites the suttas in a given book is that they revolve around the same number of items. So the Book of Threes, you have virtually a miscellaneous compilation of discourses which revolve around 3 items. So there are 3 things, O monks, that should be abandoned. What are those 3? And the Buddha will explain. There are 3 things that lead to well-being and happiness in this life and in future lives. What are those 3 things? And so on. Okay, so as I pondered the suttas when I was reading them back in my early days as a monk, what I did was to make up the table of contents for myself on pieces of loose leaf paper, and I would designate each section of the contents according to a theme that we encounter in the Sutta Pitaka. And then when I would come across a sutta or a passage dealing with that theme, then I would note it in this compilation that I was making. I would put a few key words of the passage and then the place where that passage is to be found. So in that way, I was able to get a kind of very, very broad overview of how the different teachings fit together. Then sometime around 2001, 2002, Wisdom Publications, which had published my earlier Nikaya translations, asked me to prepare what they would call a college textbook that would be an anthology of the Buddha's discourses. They originally suggested something like 200 pages, an anthology of 200 pages. And so I set about that task, but as I was going through it, I made up my list of topics according to my understanding of the broad, what I call the architecture or the scaffolding of the Buddha's teaching. But as I was going through each of the topics, then I would think, well, we have to put in this sutta on that topic. We can't leave that one out. And so at the end, what started out as a 200-page project turned into something like a 450-page book.
Wow.
It's a book called In the Buddha's Words, though it includes introduction to each chapter, fairly extensive notes, and so on. So if you take the amount of sutta material itself, maybe it's about 375 to 400 pages. Okay, but it is basically that the scheme that underlies that book that I've laid out in this table of contents that I sent for distribution to the people who registered for this talk. And it's this that I want to use as the basis for my talk. And so we know that the Buddha's teaching is a very practical teaching. He's not out to set up a theoretical system, a philosophical system, but his teaching, as he says, is directed towards, on the one hand, it's helping us to emerge from suffering, from misery and suffering, and on the other, to find true well-being and happiness. And so for this reason, the Buddha himself, during his long life of teaching, didn't lay out a very broad and comprehensive program showing how all of his teachings can fit together into an integral whole. But rather, the Buddha teaches according to the needs, interests, and aptitudes of the people that he's addressing. And so for that reason, we have a vast multitude of distinct discourses, which you would say that they're consistent with each other, that they're linked together in various ways, but he doesn't lay out in one long discourse the entire scheme into which all of his teachings can be fitted. Okay, so what I did to establish such a scheme of classification is to draw upon the practical aim of the Buddha's teaching, which is to promote well-being and happiness. And then I followed a distinction made in the Buddha's commentaries between three kinds of good, or three kinds of well-being and happiness to which the Buddha's teaching leads. So these are called, or we translate them as the well-being and happiness visible in this present life, or the well-being and happiness that pertains to this present existence right here and now. So that is the first broad category. The second broad category is the well-being and happiness to be achieved in a future life. This is by attaining a fortunate or a happy rebirth. Because as I'll explain, the Buddha teaches that this life is not the only life that we live, but we are caught in this sequence, beginningless sequence of repeated existences of one existence following another. And so we want to be, at least to ensure that we are achieve for ourselves a fortunate rebirth in our next existence. But then, so that is the well-being and happiness pertaining to the future life. But then the Buddha teaches that all modes of existence within the cycle of repeated birth and death, all modes of existence, when looked at with the eye of wisdom, turn out to be unsatisfactory, to be defective, to be, even you could say, to be dangerous. And so what the Buddha teaches as the ultimate aim is to break the cycle of repeated birth and death by gaining liberation or realizing nirvana or nibbana. So that is the highest good, which the Buddha calls simply the paramatta, the supreme good, the good of liberation. Okay, so those are the three broad categories into which I divided, that I used as a scheme for classifying the Buddha's teachings. And so when one reads the Buddha's discourses, one should try to determine what level these teachings are intended to address. What is the underlying purpose of this teaching? Who are the people to whom it's addressed? And what is the aim that the Buddha is trying to, towards which the Buddha is trying to direct the people that make up his audience? Okay, so now I want to go into a bit more detail to sort of flesh out this general scheme. Okay, so first we start off with, and what's interesting is that you could see these three types of good, with three goals of the teaching, as forming a kind of graded, arranged a kind of graded sequence, so that the well-being and happiness pertaining to the present life is the foundation or basis. In order to advance further, one has to establish those principles that pertain to well-being and happiness in this life as a basis for advancing further. And then to advance further, one has to go on to cultivate the practices that conduce to the well-being and happiness in the future life. So that will basically take the principles that lead to well-being and happiness here and now, but supplement them with some additional practices and qualities to be cultivated.
So
and then
stages to this, right?
Yeah, you could say that there are stages, though it's not that you have to go into a future life before you can reach the ultimate good. Okay, but you could say that the practices that conduce to well-being and happiness in the future life serve as a additional foundation for cultivating the practices that lead to the ultimate good. Okay, so the happiness visible in this present life basically involves, we say, living an ethical life, living a life that accords with ethical principles. And in fact, like this is one sort of nuance or meaning of the word Dharma. So we say that the Buddha, what the Buddha teaches is the Dhamma. And what is the meaning of Dhamma? But Dhamma is that which upholds or supports. And we could say that Dhamma is that which upholds and supports us in our quest to avoid the drop into states of suffering and misery, and which upholds and supports us in our quest for well-being and happiness. And so the first level in applying the Dhamma is to lead an ethical life, since it's this conforming to the principles of moral conduct that support us and sustain us in our efforts to attain well-being and happiness here and now. And so you can see when people violate the basic principles of ethics by engaging in things like acts like killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, use of intoxicants, that this leads to affliction and misery in one's own personal life, and it strains relationships with others. And so in order to establish both internal well-being, a sense of wholeness, a sense of personal integrity, a sense of inner joy, one has to lead a moral life. And in order to establish harmony and concord at different levels in our relationships with others, one has to lead a moral life and persuade others to also lead a moral life. And so we have relationships within the family, the community, the whole society. And so one sutta that I include in this chapter, at least the central portion of that sutta, which shows how one conforms to these principles that lead to well-being and happiness here and now, is a sutta in the Digha Nikaya called the Sea Galakasutra. It's a discourse that the Buddha gives to a young man that he saw worshiping when the Buddha was leaving the town one day. He saw this young man worshiping the 6 directions, the 4 primary directions, the sky and the earth. And then he asked the young man, what is he doing? And he said, I'm worshiping the 6 directions. And then the Buddha said, why are you doing this? And then the young man said, my father passed away recently. And before he died, he asked me to make a promise to worship the 6 directions. And so I'm doing this to fulfill the promise I made to my father. Then the Buddha said, well, that is one way of worshiping the 6 directions. But there is another way of worshiping the 6 directions, which is taught in the discipline of the noble ones. And then the Buddha explained his way of worshiping the 6 directions. And what he does is to establish 6 relationships in which a person might find himself or herself. And so he speaks about worshiping the north. I just have to refresh my memory. So there's the east is one's parents. And so there are duties that a child should perform towards their parents, and also a set of duties that the parents should perform in relation to the child. Then the southern direction is the relationship between the student and the teacher. So the Buddha lays down duties of a student to the teacher and duties of the teacher to the student. The western direction is the relationship between husband and wife. There are duties that the husband should perform towards the wife towards a husband. The northern direction is the relationship between friends. So the duties that friends have towards each other. And then the north, the nadir, the lower direction, is the relationship between an employer and his employees. So each of these have duties towards each other. And then the upper direction, the zenith, are ascetics and Brahmins. And so there are duties that a lay devotee should perform towards ascetics and Brahmins, and also duties that ascetics and Brahmins should perform towards the lay supporter.
So the 6 directions are like a metaphor, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So just as geographically, we find ourselves at the center of 6 directions, so within our life, we find ourselves sort of enmeshed in these 6 types of relationships. And what's interesting is that in regard to each relationship, it's not just the duty of one individual towards others, but in each relationship, each member in that relationship has duties towards the others. And it's when they fulfill these duties that this is what conduces to a harmonious, healthy, flourishing society. Okay, so that provides a kind of broad perspective on the kinds of ethical obligations that we incur in order to find this happiness in this present life. But there are other suttas that I've included in this chapter which deal in greater detail with some of these specific relationships. And we find these particularly in the Anguttara Nikaya, the numerical discourses, because these type of suttas lend themselves to a numerical style of presentation. So, for example, the Buddha has numbers of suttas emphasizing the importance of filial piety, of children showing respect to their parents and having gratitude towards their parents, repaying the kindness of their parents. Suttas on different types of marriages, the obligations of husbands and wives to one another. What are the kinds of qualities that lead to a happy marriage? What are the qualities that lead to a discordant, disruptive marriage? Then we have suttas on right livelihood. What are the types of wrong livelihood to be avoided? What are the types of right livelihood to be pursued? Suttas on how to use wealth. That would be like an interesting example.
Be interesting for us students because we don't get much wealth yet.
Yeah, but that time will come, even if you don't get to be very wealthy. But
if I recall, the Buddha suggested that we split our wealth into 4, right?
yeah, in fact, that's exactly the sutta that I'm looking for. So he speaks about that with the wealth that he gains, he makes himself happy and pleased and maintains himself in happiness. Then he makes his parents happy and pleased and maintains them in happiness. He makes his wife and children and the servants of the house happy and pleased. Then he makes his friends and colleagues happy and pleased. And that is just the first use of wealth. The second use of wealth is as a kind of insurance against loss in the future. A third use of wealth is distributed in various ways to provide hospitality to relatives, guests, ancestors, to pay taxes to the king, to make offerings to the devas, the deities. And then the fourth use of wealth is to make offerings to ascetics and Brahmins. Then there are suttas that deal with the happiness of a householder. And, excuse me?
It's Vyagapaja Sutra.
Yes.
We would like to remind our audience to please mute your microphones. You will get a chance to ask a question.
Yeah, it's better to leave the questions and comments for later. Suttas on the woman of the house, the duties of the women. But then going broader, going beyond the range of the family, there are suttas that deal with establishing communal harmony. Like some of these come from the advice that the Buddha gave to the monastic community, but they can be applied to the broader society. Like, for example, the roots of conflict and disputes. He mentioned 6 roots of conflicts and disputes. Then, in contrast to that, 6 things that lead to cordial relationships, to harmony and unity. For example, loving kindness expressed in bodily action, speech, and thought, sharing our belongings with others, observing the precepts, and holding right views. And even in this broad category of the happiness that leads to the well-being, but the principles that lead to well-being and happiness in this present life, the Buddha includes teachings given to the king on how to administer the country in order to promote the well-being of the country. And even though we don't have monarchical forms of government today, but some of these principles we could extrapolate to our present forms of government. And he emphasizes very strongly the responsibility of the government, in his case, the king, to ensure that there is no poverty in the country, to ensure that wealth is equitably distributed, and to ensure that everybody can earn their living in a way that conforms to their own skills and background.
So I think politicians should take a page from the Buddhist book.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Okay, so this maybe would be enough to cover some of the material that comes under the well-being and happiness pertaining to the present life. But then we come to the next major division of the teaching, which are those discourses concerned with achieving well-being and happiness in the future life. And I call this chapter The Way to a Fortunate Rebirth. And as the background to this chapter, I present material on karma and rebirth. Since the Buddha teaches, as I mentioned earlier, that this life is not the only life that we live, but this life is just like one link in this chain of existences going back without first point. And when this life comes to an end, unless we attain nirvana within this life, we're going to have to face a future life. And so we want to establish the conditions that will ensure that we achieve a fortunate rebirth in the future. And so the principle that underlies the process of rebirth is the law of karma. And so we have some suttas dealing with the meaning of karma. So in brief, karma is volitional action. That is action, whether bodily, verbal, or purely mental action, that originates from intention, volition, the activity of mind by which we establish a purpose and then act on the basis of that purpose. So from a materialist perspective, all of our actions, they might have moral significance in the eyes of others, in the eyes of the law right now in this life. But when we die, the body disintegrates and everything comes to an end. We don't have to face the consequences of our action, apart from the praise and blame that people speak about us after our death. But according to the Buddha's teaching, all of our volitional actions, especially those that are morally significant, leave impressions in the stream of the mind. Or metaphorically, we could say they deposit seeds in the mind. And those seeds bear the imprint of the moral character of the actions, the ethical quality of the actions in which we engage. And so the general principle, there are multiple planes of existence according to the Buddhist cosmology. The 5 planes going from the bottom, the hells, to the animal realm, the realm of the pretas or miserable spirits, the human realm, and then various heavenly and divine realms. And so the basic principle behind the law of karma is that unwholesome actions, that is, actions rooted in greed, hatred, and ignorance, create unwholesome karma. And if that unwholesome karma becomes, when it gets the opportunity to ripen, it will ripen in the form of misery and suffering for ourselves. And if that karma, unwholesome karma, becomes strong enough, then it will propel the stream of consciousness into an unfortunate rebirth in our next existence, even to rebirth in one of the realms of misery. And then in contrast, wholesome karma, that is actions rooted in non-greed, non-hate, non-delusion, or in generosity, kindness, and wisdom. So those actions create wholesome karma, which ripens in the form of well-being and happiness. And when those karmas get the chance to govern the rebirth process, they bring rebirth in good destination, in the happy realms. And they lead, when we come into the human realm, they bring good fortune in our human existence. And so what is the key to wholesome karma? This is what the Buddha uses the word, it's a word from the ancient Indian tradition, punya, which is what we translate a little unsatisfactory. The translation is a little unsatisfactory, but we use the rendering merit. The English word suggests that there's somebody sort of looking down on us, putting golden stars on our report card. But that is not what is involved here. But merit means simply a kind of power or potency in wholesome actions to produce, to bring forth results, desirable results in the future.
So it's not like Santa Claus where you get taken down if you're naughty and nice, right?
It's certainly not. No. Yeah, the one who takes the notes is our own stream of consciousness. So all of our actions they leave imprints in the stream of consciousness. And then just through the unfolding of a natural law, they will bring their results on their own. But there are certain kinds of deeds, what we call meritorious deeds, that have that power, that potency to bring results that fulfill our higher desires. And these can be just mundane desires, not necessarily lofty spiritual desires. The desire for good health, for long life, for a fair degree of affluence, for opportunities to get a good education, to have a respectable position in society, to win friends, and to win the admiration of others. So these are sort of mundane, desirable aims, which are to be achieved through creating and cultivating meritorious deeds. And then the Buddha, though there are many, many kinds of meritorious deeds, but in the suttas, the Buddha sort of sums them up in what he is called the three bases of merit. So the three bases of merit are giving, or the practice of generosity. And so the practice of giving, it brings its own well-being and happiness even in this life itself, since one could see when one practices generosity, even though you have to part from your wealth and possessions, but you could see directly here and now that it brings a kind of freedom from attachment. It brings a sense of it promotes one's own self-esteem. It gives a sense of one's own inner dignity that one could give and share with others and help others. But also the act of giving creates the meritorious karma, which will serve as a counteractive against poverty and oppressive need in the future. And so there are many suttas that we find dealing with the practice of giving. And in one sutta that I included here, the Buddha says that he praises especially the gift of food. And he says that if one understood the benefits of giving food as I understand them, even if one were down to one's last morsel of food, you would be willing to share it with somebody else if there was another person present. So when we established Buddhist Global Relief, we took that as one of our mottos.
I see.
Yeah. Okay, so we have giving. And of course, there are different types of giving material things, giving safety, and the highest giving is the giving of the Dharma. And then the second base of merit is sila, moral discipline, good behavior, good conduct, particularly as the constant observance for the lay disciple, observing the 5 precepts to abstain from killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, false speech, and use of intoxicants, but then as a intensified form of ethical observance or moral discipline, the Buddha highly recommends the Uposatha observance. That is, on the day of the full moon and the new moon, to take the 8 precepts. I won't go into the 8 precepts here, but if you go to Anguttara Nikaya, Book of Eights, Sutta number 41, you'll find them enumerated there. And the 8 precepts are in a way emulating or following the 10 precepts of a novice monk. So when one observes the 8 precepts, one is living almost like a novice monk, at least for one day and night. Okay, then the third base of merit is, in Pali, is called bhavana, which means literally development or cultivation. But this is what we translate as meditation. And I'm going to come more into meditation as we come to the ultimate pursuit of the ultimate good. So what is probably intended by meditation as a base of merit would be the development of the 4 immeasurable states of mind, what's also known as the 4 Brahma Viharas, the 4 divine abodes, the meditations of loving kindness, compassion, altruistic joy, and equanimity. And also perhaps here some of the devotional meditations, like recollection of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So those are ways of developing the mind in a wholesome direction that are esteemed not so much at this level for their capacity to lead to liberation, but rather for their capacity to generate the kind of wholesome karma that will lead one to a higher rebirth in the future, either back into good circumstances in the human realm, in the heavenly realms, or if one develops the Brahma Viharas to the highest extent, into what is called the Brahma world, the divine realms. Okay, now we make the transition to the pursuit of the ultimate good, which is the attainment of liberation, the realization of nirvana, nibbana. But to prepare the way to understanding the need for this type of good, we have to understand the flaws and defects in all states of conditioned existence within the world. In fact, it doesn't really take a Buddha to show us the way to well-being and happiness in this life. For that, we could rely maybe on Aristotle or Socrates, some of the Stoic philosophers. Aristotle, yeah. It doesn't take a Buddha to show us the way to the heavenly realms. For that, we have other teachings of the theistic religions. But the special task of the Buddha is to show us the way to final liberation from the entire cycle of repeated birth and death. And so to arrive at that level, we have to begin by looking deeply and clearly into the nature of existence within the world. And so I have included in the book a chapter here called Deepening One's Perspective on the World, where the Buddha, in a general way, he lays out 3 points of view from which we can look at life within the world. So he calls these, I translate them as gratification, danger, and escape. So gratification means seeing that life in the world and any realm of existence, or at least any realm from the human realm up to the heavenly realms, does include enjoyment, pleasure, mundane happiness, which is gratifying, fulfilling, attractive, but which can also keep us in bondage when there's attachment to it. So the second perspective is seeing the danger in worldly enjoyment, that all worldly enjoyment is impermanent, that it's not fully satisfactory, that it's empty and hollow, without any substance, and bound to change. And then the third perspective is called escape or release, which means seeing into the task that has to be accomplished to break our bondage to the attachment that keeps us tied to the world. Okay, and then to further deepen our perspective on the world, there are numbers of suttas which point out especially the, what I call the pitfalls and sensual pleasures, the defects in sensual pleasures, how sensual enjoyment, even though it brings the temporary happiness and well-being, but is not fully satisfactory. And the more we attach ourselves to sensual enjoyments, the more we become bound to them and expose ourselves to the ravishes of impermanence, death, and even moral transgression. And then from the broadest perspective, the Buddha shows us what I call the dangers of samsara. So there are some suttas. These are in the Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 15, on the dangers of samsara. So he says, for example, that as we've wandered from one life to another, going from birth to death, we've shed, and from death to new birth, we've shed more tears than there is water in the great oceans. And as we've been slaughtered and killed from life to life, being beheaded or killed in war and battle, we've shed more blood than there's water in the ocean. And so when one reflects deeply on these suttas, then it instills a sense of disenchantment with life within the world. It turns one away even from the pursuit of long life and bliss in the heavenly realms, and sort of sets one out on the path to liberation. So then the remaining chapters in the book deal with the path to liberation. First, I take a broad view of the path to liberation, which is based on a number of suttas, particularly that we find some in the Digha Nikaya, but I use the somewhat shorter version that we find in the Majjhima Nikaya. And even though the Buddha says that the path to liberation can be followed by disciples of any calling, whether lay disciples or monastic disciples, but when he's laying out the complete and comprehensive path to liberation, he takes the monastic life as the model, because it's the monastic life that, at least in theory, provides the ideal circumstances for pursuing the full time the path to liberation. So I take as the model of that path the sutta number 27 in the Majjhima Nikaya, in which the Buddha lays out what is called the Anupubasika, the sequential training, where we progress from, begins with a disciple hearing the Dhamma, gaining faith in the Buddha, and then deciding to pursue the path full time by taking the step of renunciation and entering monastic life. Then they first observe the ethical stipulations of the monastic training, then progress to contentment with the simple requisites of alms bowl, robes, a simple dwelling, then progress to training and restraint of the senses, then practicing mindfulness and clear comprehension in everyday life, then moving on to overcoming the hindrances of the mind, entering into the deeper states of meditation, and then attaining the higher knowledges, culminating in liberation. So when you read that sutta, it gives the impression, and this was the impression that I had when I first became a monk, that you could accomplish the whole practice in like a few days, maybe a few weeks, a few months. Certainly a year is much more time than I would need. But when I actually started to undertake the practice, I saw it was not so simple, that you have to really undertake a very rigorous course of training with many different aspects. And so we could say that the graduated or sequential training laid out in suttas like Majjhima Nikaya Sutta 27 provides us a kind of bird's eye view of the training. Or maybe it's a little bit like when using a map on Google Earth. Like I want to look at India, so I just type into Google India, then it will give me a map. And so from my perspective, I can see all of India just on my computer screen. But if I want to get from one point in India to another, maybe from Bangalore to Nagapatini, I can't do so by relying just on that very broad general map of India, but I have to click the plus sign on the map, which will take me down, 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 blowing up the map of South India so that I could see in greater detail, see Bangalore, the roads leading out of Bangalore, and then I could trace which is the road that leads from Bangalore to Nagapatini on the East Coast. And so in the next two chapters, I sort of blow up the map of the sequential training by having a chapter called Mastering the Mind, which explores in greater detail the different approaches to meditation. What are the hindrances to mental development? How do we deal with these hindrances? What are the different types of distracting thoughts that we have to contend with? How do we overcome these distracting thoughts? What are the different meditation subjects that that we find in the suttas? And how are these meditation subjects to be cultivated and mastered? And so when we take these suttas, which are scattered throughout the Nikayas, we can, when we bring them all together, we can get a very a broad view of the process of cultivating the mind and mastering the mind. And so when the mind is mastered, it brings at least enough samadhi or concentration to be able to undertake the key element in the Buddha's path, which is the development of wisdom. And so the next chapter sort of shifts the focus and blows up the section of the map dealing with the development of wisdom. So here I have suttas on the conditions for developing wisdom, and then particularly suttas on the what I call the domain of wisdom. So these are suttas that deal with exploring and investigating the 5 aggregates, that is the constituents of experience that the Buddha summed up in bodily form, feeling, perception, the volitional activities, and consciousness. Then investigating experience in terms of the 6 or 12 sense bases: eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind faculty, and their respective objects. or by way of the elements, the 18 elements, 4 elements, 6 elements, dependent origination. I'm not going to explain these here, but I just want to mention them to indicate that these are the topics, you could say, that comprise the training in wisdom. And so when you're reading the Nikayas, and when you come across these suttas, then you know that the Buddha is expounding these suttas in order to guide his disciples in how to develop the higher wisdom, the wisdom that will bring liberation. And what makes things very convenient in studying the Nikayas is that the suttas on these topics, at least the most important suttas, have been collected into individual chapters in the Samyutta Nikaya. So the Samyutta Nikaya has individual chapters on the 5 aggregates, the 12 sense bases, the 18 elements, dependent origination, and the 4 noble truths. Okay, then in the last chapter of the book, I come to the stages that are reached when wisdom reaches its culmination. So wisdom is not just an open-ended process. The development of wisdom is not just an open-ended process, but the purpose of wisdom, developing wisdom, is to reach certain stages of realization through which one cuts off the fetters, the defilements that bind us to the cycle of repeated birth and death. And so the Buddha has enumerated 4 primary stages, which are kind of stepping stones to ultimate liberation. And so when you reach the first of these stages, which is called stream entry, at this point, wisdom has come to such a peak of development that one sees into the very essence of the Dhamma, the ultimate truth of the Dhamma. And with that, one cuts off the coarsest fetters, and one becomes bound to reach liberation in a maximum of 7 more lives. But beyond the stage of stream entry, there are still 3 more stages. And so one continues to cultivate the factors of the path. When one reaches the next stage, then one weakens the remaining fetters, and one becomes a once returner who will come back to this world only 1 more time and then reach liberation. But one can still continue to pursue the path further. And as one does so, then one reaches the stage of what's called non-returning, where one cuts off the fetters that bind one to the sensory realm of existence, but one will still take rebirth in one of the divine realms, in the form realm. But there's still 1 stage beyond that, which is the stage of arhatship. And when one reaches that stage, then one cuts off the subtle remaining fetters, and then one gains liberation in this life itself. So that is the final goal, the attainment of arhatship. But amongst the arhats, there are different gradations. Even though they're all alike, they're all identical in attaining ultimate liberation, but there are different gradations according to the extent of their knowledge, their capacity for understanding, their skills and spiritual powers, and especially their skills in teaching. And amongst all of the arhats, the one who is supreme and the one who is supreme, the sort of ultimate arhat, is the Buddha himself. And so the last section of the final chapter is on the Tathagata, the Buddha himself, and the special qualities that distinguish him amongst all of the arhats. Okay, perhaps this can do for my broad presentation. And now I think we can devote some time to questions.
Thank you, Bhante, for that excellent talk.
Oh,
And
thank you.
I see that we have several questions in the chat. So what I would like to do is that I've actually recorded the people who have submitted their questions earlier. And so I would like to mention the people who have submitted the questions. And if I mention your name, you can turn on your mic and you can ask the question directly to Bhante, if you don't mind. So
Yeah, I wonder if I could lay down a certain condition on questions.
Oh, sure. No problem, Bhante.
I would like questions to be relevant to my talk.
Okay. Yes.
Rather than questions like I usually give sort of my favorite example. Bhante, can you explain the relationship between the Buddhist teaching and quantum mechanics? I see I have my friend here, Wiley, who sent me a lot of material on quantum mechanics, some videos on quantum mechanics, so I could get brushed up on that material to answer those kind of questions.
Okay, so for the first question, it is relevant. It's from Mr. Dedi Shen, and he asks about volition alone and karma.
Yeah.
And so, Mr. Dedi Shen, would you kindly open your mic and you can ask the question directly to Bhante.
Hello.
Hello. Yes.
Yep.
I'm sorry. My English may be not very good, but I want to ask Bhante if someone act, I do not act. I mean, he only have a pollution in his mind. Is that become a mind karma or what? Or just pollution is just pollution? It's not. He, for example, he think he want to do giving, charity, generosity, but he do not act it, but he just want to act it, but he just have a pollution to act it. What do you think, Bhante? I'm sorry, my English is not very...
No, I think I understand the question. I would say in that case, taking the example you give, to have the volition, the intention to practice giving is good in itself. And I would say that that volition is, maybe it will generate some wholesome karma. But the wholesome karma generated just by having the volition of giving without actually practicing giving would not be as strong as having the volition of giving and practicing the act of giving. And in fact, if you have the opportunity to give, you form the volition to give, then you meet an opportunity to practice giving, but you don't practice giving, that's probably because some other volition has arisen that is prohibiting, that is inhibiting one from giving. And that would be an unwholesome volition, would be a volition of miserliness. And so if you have the intention to give, the volition of giving, then it's good when you meet the opportunity to practice to actually complete the act.
Okay. Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you, Mr. Dedi Shen, for that question. Now, for the second question, Mr. Kent M, he actually submitted two questions, but for the sake of respect towards the audience, I think we'll just take his first question, which is about, did the Buddha teach both Samatha and Vipassana during his time? Mr. Kent M, would you open your microphone and ask the question to Bhante?
Okay, good morning, Bhante.
Good morning.
Actually, I have two questions, but first, my first question is, did the Buddha teach the meditation technique of Samatha and Vipassana? And the second one is, it's a simple one, how to reconcile the difference between Sutta and Abhidhamma? That's it.
Okay, let's take the first question. Yes, we could say that that the Buddha emphasized the importance of developing both Samatha and Vipassana. What's interesting is that in the Visuddhimagga, which is a sort of meditation treatise in the Theravada, is highly esteemed in the Theravada tradition. We have lists of meditation subjects, which are said to be the means of developing samatha, and then other meditation approaches, which are said to be the means of developing vipassana. But in the Sutta Pitaka, to my knowledge, we don't find specific alignment of meditation subjects with some meditation subjects with samatha and other meditation subjects with vipassana, but rather we find, let us say, ways of directing or training the mind that conduce to samatha, and other ways of directing the mind that conduce to vipassana. And here, just for those who don't know Pali, samatha means tranquility, calmness, or concentration of mind, and vipassana means insight, the insight that brings wisdom. And so when the Buddha, I think one finds this, I think I included that sutta in this anthology, when he speaks about what is the way of directing the mind that leads to samatha, he said it is what leads, it's the skill in being able to stabilize the mind, to make the mind firm, steady, unified, and concentrated. Whereas the skills that lead to vipassana is the ability to examine sankharas, as conditioned phenomena, to discern sankharas, and to penetrate into the characteristics of sankharas. And so we don't find the words samatha and vipassana used that often within the suttas, but we find a lot of instructions that the Buddha gives on how to concentrate and stabilize the mind. And then many other suttas in which the Buddha explains how to contemplate and to view conditioned phenomena. And so we could, when you understand what is involved in developing samatha and vipassana, then we could understand that these suttas that explain how to overcome the hindrances, to stabilize and steady the mind, to unify the mind, those are concerned with samatha. And those suttas that are concerned with investigating and examining the nature of phenomena, those are laying out the methods for developing insight or vipassana. Yeah, the other question about relating the sutta and Abhidhamma Pitaka, it's a very big question, but I just in very broad terms. Sometimes I've heard it said that the suttas are expounded in conventional terms, the Abhidhamma in ultimate terms. I don't quite agree with that characterization. What I would say is that the suttas have a primarily pragmatic orientation, that they're concerned with giving directions for practice aimed at realization, and that the amount of systematic organization in the suttas is rather minimal, whereas the Abhidhamma is concerned with developing a very broad, comprehensive scheme of classification and analysis that could comprise all of the elements mentioned in the suttas into one scheme.
Okay, does that answer your question?
Actually, the second question is how to reconcile the difference. I mean, for example, in Sutta, the definition of jhana, we have 4 factors, if I'm not mistaken, and in Abhidhamma, it have 5 factors. If I'm the 5th factor is ekagata, but sometimes in Sutta there is no ekagata. How to reconcile these 2 versions?
Yeah, I think this gets a little too, far
Too
from
technical.
the topic of,
Yeah,
it becomes too much of a specific point.
Yeah, so I'm sorry,
Well,
but
but
I
I
think
should just say that ekagata is, in fact, often mentioned in the suttas. First, it's mentioned as a jhana factor by Sariputta in Majjhima Nikaya Sutta number 43. And then it's mentioned by the Buddha as in relation to the development of samatha or samadhi.
Okay, thank you for your question, Mr.
Yeah,
Kent.
thank you.
Now we will need to move on to the third question, which was posed by Mr. John Grace, and he asked about advice on how to approach difficult suttas. So, Mr. John Grace.
Yes, Bhante. You told us about the overall Nikayas. I was wondering if you have any advice for us about approaching an individual sutta that we are having difficulty with, such as dealing with difficult concepts, taking notes, getting practical benefit out of them.
Yeah, what I would say is that when one meets a difficult sutta, you could just, it might seem like I'm trying to escape your question. What I say is put it aside for the time being and go on to other suttas that are more comprehensible. And what could very well happen is that as you read other suttas that are more comprehensible, it will give you some of the tools that you need or the insights that you need to be able to understand the more difficult suttas. To give you one example, in the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle length discourses, the first sutta is called Mula Pariyaya Sutta, the discourse on the root. And when I recommend people to read the Majjhima Nikaya, I always tell them, don't begin with the Mula Pariyaya Sutta, with the first sutta. Rather, what I say is read the rest of the Majjhima Nikaya, and when you finish, then you can come back to the first sutta. Because when you come, after you've read the rest of the Majjhima Nikaya, or maybe you also read the Samyutta, at least the major chapters in the Samyutta Nikaya, then you can come back to the first sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya. Then you might be able to understand it better. Just some more on this. Yeah, there are some suttas which are indeed very difficult to understand, and even for myself, particularly some suttas in the Sutta Nipata, and they're different interpreters will have different interpretations. So we shouldn't think that there's just one correct interpretation which everybody agrees upon, but different interpretations. And I find it helpful sometimes with difficult words, difficult phrases, to look at the commentary. But the commentaries are at present almost all only in Pali, not yet in English translation. So if you don't read Pali, then it's not that useful. And sometimes I don't always agree with the commentary, but it's at least helpful to get the commentary perspective on a passage or a sutta. But my basic advice is, if you don't understand the sutta, don't worry too much about it, since there are, what you should focus on are the suttas that you can understand. And then in time, perhaps as you sort of delve more deeply into the Dhamma, then you can come back to the more difficult suttas and understand them.
Okay, sir. Does that answer your question?
Yes, probably comes back to what I suppose your main, topic for this talk.
Yeah. I guess Bhante's advice is really useful because it also happens to me sometimes. I read something, I don't understand it, so I move on to other things, and then I get some insight. Okay, so we will move on to the next question, and it was asked by one of our members, actually, Fenny, and she asked about how to encourage young people to learn about the suttas. Fenny, you can open your mic and ask the question directly to Bhante. Yeah.
Okay, Namo Buddhaya, Bante. Okay, so I'd like to ask, especially these days, any advice for a youngster like us? Suttas, like, like
I'm not getting
Yeah.
the sound clearly.
It seems that there's trouble with the microphone, so I'll just talk for her.
okay.
So she's asking how to encourage youngsters, young people, to read the suttas, because it kind of seems tedious for young people, especially with all the repetition and all the vocabulary.
Yeah, it depends on what is meant by young people, what age range. Since young people could range from 13 to, nowadays I hear people in their early 30s being called young people.
So I guess teenagers and young adults in their 20s, I guess.
I would say that it would be quite difficult to get young people to go directly into the suttas. What I would think is to awaken the interest of young people in the Dhamma through expositions in more modern terms, explanations that make the Dhamma more accessible and meaningful in terms of their own experience, their own cultural background. But I would say for those, maybe not teenagers, at least not those from 13 to 18, but maybe from 18 up, who have had already some exposure to the Dhamma, some explanation of the fundamentals, then it's not that I want to blow my trumpet, but I would recommend this book. Is it showing? It looks like I have empty hands. Okay. It's the book In the Buddha's Words, published by Wisdom Publications. This is the book on which I've based this talk, which gives the systematic presentation of the Dhamma. So for an intellectually curious young person from the age of 18 up, I would say that this book would help them get into the suttas and to appreciate them.
Okay, so a reading recommendation for us youngsters, right? Thank you, Bhante. And we now move on to the next question, and this may possibly be our last question because our time is almost up. So this comes from Mr. Sud, and his question relates to mindfulness and how to develop mindfulness in the path. So I ask Mr. Sud to please open your microphone and you can ask.
Yeah, but I'd say Mr. Sud is in my regular Saturday class.
Oh, I see.
He could ask that question on another Saturday. Why don't you take one from your group, from the Indonesian group?
Okay.
I don't want him to feel offended, but just give your group the chance to ask.
No problem, Bhante. Thank you. No problem.
Okay, so there's another question from I assume she's a Mrs. Tara, and she asks, Dear Bhante, she asks about the Arahants, actually. So Mrs. Tara, would you open your mic and you can ask the question to Bhante?
Yes, Bhante. Hello.
Hello, yeah.
Yes, I would like to ask you. You were saying about the Arahant. There are many types of Arahant. Can you please tell me where can I read in the suttas regarding the type of Arahant?
Okay, the main distinction amongst the Arahats is between, I think I have it in this anthology too. Let me just take a look. No, I don't think it's here. Okay, the main distinction amongst the Arhats is between those who are said to be liberated in both respects and liberated by wisdom. Okay, those who are liberated in both respects are those who are able to achieve liberation through wisdom, but they also are able to attain the arupa, or the formless or non-material meditative absorptions. So those are 4 stages of samadhi that lie beyond the 4 jhanas. So they're said to be liberated in both respects, because they're liberated from all defilements and from samsara through wisdom. And also they're liberated from the limitations of the mind through the power of their samadhi. The other type of arhats are those liberated by wisdom. So they have the wisdom that cuts off the defilements, and they can have the jhanas, but they don't have mastery over the formless or immaterial meditative absorptions. So they are less skilled in samadhi than the arhats liberated in both respects. Okay, then amongst the arhats, further distinctions, some arhats in addition have what are called the three clear knowledges. That is the recollection of their previous lives, the divine eye by which they can see how beings pass away and take rebirth in accordance with their karma, and the knowledge of liberation. Whereas other arhats will have the knowledge of liberation, but not the two former types of knowledge. And then beyond that, other arhats will have still more types of psychic powers, whereas other arhats don't have those powers.
May I have the reference of the sutta of those, please, Bante?
Yeah, you find the distinction between the two kinds of arhats, liberated in both respects, liberated by wisdom, in Majjhima Nikaya Sutta number 70. At least that's the main place where that distinction. 70.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bante.
Okay. Thank you very much for the question, Tara, and we thank you to everyone who has asked the question. So I am so sorry to everyone who has asked the question but did not get the chance to ask it directly to Bante, because we are short on time. So I'm afraid that we will have to end our question and answer session here. And before we end it, I'd like to just conclude our discussion for the last hour and a half. So to summarize, Bante talks about the Tipitaka, consisting of 40 volumes, and it's huge. So for the lay Buddhists, it would be just important to study the Sutta Pitaka. And it's not arranged in a systemic order. So what Bante did was, when he was a young monk, he made a table of contents for himself to broadly categorize them. And then the result of that work was that Bante wrote a book published by Wisdom Publications, which we should read. And then Bante also emphasizes that the Buddhist teaching is practical. It's not just theory. So the Buddha teaches according to needs. And of course, his teachings aren't just laid out in one long discourse. It's laid out in several suttas and according to the needs of the listener. And there are three main themes, which are why we should practice the Dhamma, which is for the well-being in this life, and then for the well-being in a future life, and then for the well-being of breaking and escaping the cycle of death and rebirth. And we should all keep in mind to conserve our 5 precepts. We should also practice the 8 precepts if we get the chance, right, Bante? And then so that we can obtain happiness in this life. And then for happiness in a future life, we should take in mind karma and rebirth. And finally, for ultimate attainment, we have to practice bhavana and all of the Buddhist teachings will eventually culminate in ultimate attainment. So now, thank you everyone for this wonderful question and answer session, and we thank the Venerable Bhikkhu for his wonderful talk. I'm sure that all of us are here are at least, we learned something new, and I hope we can all get enlightened someday. And now I would like to give the floor to the MC for, we have something special for Bante. So Francisca.
Thank you, Christopher. Now, we would like to give a certificate of appreciation to Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi Mahāthera. This certificate will be given by Mr. Delvin to Venerable Bhikkhu. So, we would like to invite Delvin and Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. Now, let's hear what is inside this certificate. Mr. Delvin, please do the honors.
Okay, thank you, Francisca. I would like to use this opportunity to give this certificate of appreciation to the Most Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi Mahāthera as the guest speaker for today's Dhamma talk. It is a pleasure and a great honor for ITBC to have you as our speaker for this Dhamma talk. On behalf of ITBC, we say thank you, and we hope in the future there will be another opportunity inviting you again. Thank you. Namo Buddhaya.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that wraps up our day. But I have something to say before we end. There will be a survey available, so please proceed to the Zoom chat room to find the link of the survey and please fill it up. On behalf of ITBC, I thank you all for making the time in your busy schedules to join us today. We couldn't have done this without our participants and our speaker who spent the time attending this talk. It's been our pleasure to host this event, and we would like to thank Buddhazine as our media partner for this event. I hope you enjoyed today's Dhamma talk and wish you all a pleasant day. We look forward to seeing you at our next events. Thank you.